I wasn't in a good place that spring, and that's the plainest way to say it. People expect grief to look like breaking dishes or shouting at God in a parking lot, but mine looked like leaving a mug on the porch rail until the coffee went cold, and then drinking it anyway, because it was one less decision to make. I was 52, on unpaid leave from the railroad, living in a section house I inherited and had no plans for, and letting my grown son's calls roll to voicemail until his voice sounded polite instead of hurt. Nights at Ravencut were long enough to hear your own bad habits. I'd sit in the dark with the porch light off, watch freight lights bend around the mountain, and feel like every locomotive in the state was headed somewhere I didn't belong anymore. I had worked rail most of my life, signal side, the kind of job where you measure first and talk second. Track circuits don't care about your mood. Relay cabinets don't care what month your wife died. You either have continuity or you don't. You talk to spec or you do it again. That way of thinking had always suited me. If something failed, there was a cause chain. You could trace it. Wire fatigue, moisture intrusion, loose bond, thermal expansion, human error. Pick one. Even weather had numbers. Snowpack depth, frost line. Rain totals over 24 hours. The older I got, the more I trusted the things a clipboard could hold. Feelings were slippery. A maintenance log was honest. When my wife, Marie, got sick, then got worse, then was suddenly not in the house anymore except in small surviving details, all my practical habits kept running, but none of them helped. Her gloves still hung by the mudroom door for weeks because I couldn't decide where else they should go. There was one hair tie looped around the kitchen faucet that I saw every morning and never touched. She had a way of humming off-key when she kneaded biscuit dough, a soft little tune with no rhythm to it. And for 2 months after she was gone, I'd catch myself turning toward the counter at dawn, waiting for that sound to start. It never did. That kind of silence is different from ordinary quiet. It has weight. By the second week of March, the railroad had stopped pretending I was coming back next Monday and made my leave official. My supervisor, Ed Pollard, called me from the district office and kept his voice gentle in that way men do when they're trying not to insult you by being kind. "Glenn, listen," he said. "You've got tenure and good standing. Nobody's taking your spot. But payroll needs a category. Unpaid leave gives you room. You need anything, you call me." "I'm fine," I told him, staring at the sink like it had written instructions I could follow. "I can still cover emergency response if it gets bad up there." "You're not hearing me," he said. "You don't owe the line your bones this month. Rest, walk, sit, whatever you need. We'll keep Ravencut watched." I said all right, and we both knew that wasn't true. Nobody watched Ravencut the way someone watched it who'd worked that curve 15 years and could hear a bad joint bar from 50 yards away. The section house sat above milepost 47, where the mountain pinched the line into a hard left bend, locals called Ravencut. It had been my grandfather's place when steam was fading out and diesel was king. Board siding, metal roof, stove that ran hot on one side, porch pitched just enough for rain to collect in one corner. The kind of house that survives by being useful instead of pretty. I drove up with 2 duffels, Marie's quilt, my tool bag, and Boone sprawled across the bench seat like he owned the truck. Boone was an old blue heeler with cloudy eyes and a limp in cold weather, and he watched me carry boxes in as if I might do it wrong and require correction. I remember setting one carton on the table, hearing the room answer with a hollow echo, and realizing I had never once slept there alone. My son, Caleb, called that first evening while I was trying to light the pilot on the water heater. His name lit the screen, and I let it ring until the call ended. He called again 20 minutes later. Same result. On the 3rd try, he left a voicemail. "Dad, it's me. Just checking in. Aunt Linda said you were at the old place. If you want, I can drive up Saturday, bring groceries, whatever. You don't have to call right now. Just text me you're all right. I set the phone face down and listened to the heater click and breathe and finally catch. And I stood there longer than necessary, watching the blue flame steady itself. That was the shape of those days. Small machinery working as designed while I ignored the parts of life that required me to answer back. Mornings started early because rail habits don't sleep in. I'd wake around 4:30, pull on work pants out of routine, and heat water for coffee strong enough to strip paint. Dawn came slow in that cut. First grey over black timber, then a thin band of pale light over the east ridge, then the rails beginning to take a soft shine like two cold knives laid out side by side. I'd step onto the porch with my mug and boon at my boot heel, and we'd stand there in breath fog and wood smoke while the mountain sorted itself into shape. Some days I carried the spike maul on my shoulder even though I wasn't on active duty. Habit again. Weight felt better than empty hands. The walk down to the line was steep enough to make your calves talk back. Spring thaw had started but hadn't committed, so the ground took turns between frozen crust and mud that grabbed your soles. Raven Creek ran under a shelf of rotten ice and made that muted, rushing sound water makes when it's half hidden, like it doesn't want to wake anyone. Ballast shifted every year in that stretch. Freeze-thaw cycles worked ties loose. Drainage ditches filled with needles and silt. Above the inside rail, the slope held fractured shale and big weathered stones, all of it waiting for one warm rain to decide gravity had waited long enough. We called that hillside the Raven Cut Slide for good reason. It moved a little every season. Most years, a little was all you got. I still kept a notebook in my jacket pocket and wrote down things I saw, even though nobody required reports from a man on leave. Date, temperature, creek level by the old cottonwood route, tie numbers where the shoulder looked thin, culvert mouth obstruction at 12% by eye, that kind of thing. It wasn't duty so much as muscle memory, but there was comfort in it. Grief didn't follow sequence. A field log did. If I wrote enough lines in neat block letters, maybe the day stayed inside those boundaries. I told myself I was just protecting the route because any decent railroader would do the same. I did not write down that I was trying to outrun the quiet in my own kitchen. By late afternoon, the wind usually came up slope and carried cedar and whetstone and the faint metallic smell of rail dust. I'd split damp rounds behind the house, stack what would burn, and feed Boone before feeding myself. Supper was mostly canned stew or eggs. I ate standing at the counter, looking out the small square window above the sink where Marie had taped a recipe card years earlier. The tape had yellowed and one corner curled. Sometimes I read the first line without meaning to. 3 cups flour, sifted. Then I'd shut off the light and sit out front again, listening for the night freight timetable I knew by heart. There was one train in particular, westbound Manifest, that usually hit Ravencut a little after 10 if weather held, and dispatch didn't stack them east of the pass. You heard it long before the headlight showed. Low horn up canyon, rail hum tightening. Then that bright eye rounding the bend, engine noise filling the whole dark valley. Steel wheels singing against curve resistance, each car clacking over joints in a rhythm that made sense to me when almost nothing else did. I knew half the engineers by voice on the radio and by the way they handled throttle through that section. Even off shift, I found myself checking my watch against their schedule, as if punctual freight movement could prove the world was still under competent management. Caleb called every 2 or 3 days, or 3, sometimes at lunch, sometimes after dark. Once he sent a photo of his daughter holding a paper plate painted like a frog, and wrote, "Lily's school art night." She asked if Grandpa likes frogs. I stared at that message for 10 full minutes and typed, "Tell her yes," then deleted it and locked the phone. My granddaughter was 6. I had taught her to skip stones at the county lake the summer before Marie got sick. She used to run ahead on the path and look back to make sure I was watching. That memory was too bright for where I was living then. I kept putting it away like a sharp tool with no sheath. What I can tell you with certainty is this: I wasn't suicidal, and I wasn't drunk all day, and I wasn't out there looking for mysteries. I was a tired man with calloused hands and a pension chart in a drawer, trying to make it from one dawn to the next without collapsing into the parts of himself he couldn't repair. Pain, when it settles in for the long haul, gets practical. You learn where to stand so it hurts less. You learn which rooms to avoid. You learn that unanswered phones stop ringing eventually. I'd built my life around maintenance, and yet I had no tool for the central failure in my own house. Near the end of that month, rain moved in for 3 straight days, slow and cold, and the mountains started giving up winter in earnest. Snowmelt fattened the creek. Ditches ran brown. You could hear pebbles ticking down the slope above the cut if you paused long enough. Boone slept more, rising stiff but loyal each morning when I reached for my jacket. We kept our routine because routine was what I had. Coffee, porch, track walk, notes, woodpile, dark, freight lights. Another day accounted for, another day not felt. I thought that was all there would be for me for a while, just weather and steel and the long, blunt work of enduring. The next morning the rain was still there, thin and steady, tapping the metal roof like someone patient enough to knock all day. I woke at 4:30 to that sound and lay flat on my back for a minute, staring at a water stain shaped like a crooked state line, trying to decide whether getting up mattered. Boone huffed from his rug by the stove and thumped his tail once, which was his version of a roll call. I swung my legs down, found cold floorboards with my heels, and went through the motions. Kettle, grounds, enamel mug, jacket, notebook, maul. The coffee tasted burnt and weak in the same sip. I drank it anyway. Outside, the porch boards were slick, and the mountain was mostly shadow with a grey edge where daylight was trying to push through. I walked down toward milepost 47 with my hood up and the maul on my shoulder, Boone limping a little until his joints warmed. Rain had turned the path into ribbon mud, and each step made that sucking sound like the hill wanted my boots for itself. The creek was louder than yesterday, high and brown and carrying little branches under broken ice. At the cut, I checked the inside ditch, then the ballast shoulder, then the tie ends where water liked to eat away support first. Nothing dramatic, just the usual spring trouble beginning to line up. Pebbles clicked now and then from the slope above, and every click made me look up by habit. Work gave me a script: measure this, note that, move on. It was the one conversation I still knew how to have. By that afternoon, the rain eased to mist, and the house felt smaller than usual, as if wet weather pulled the walls inward. I found myself standing in the mudroom with Marie's old gloves still on the hook, looking at them like they might explain what to do with the rest of my life. They were garden gloves, green canvas with worn fingertips and one patched thumb where she'd caught barbed wire 2 summers back. She'd laughed when I offered to buy new ones and said, "These still got miles." I touched that patched thumb and had to brace a hand on the doorframe. Grief did not arrive like a storm then. It arrived like gravity, constant and uninterested in what I preferred. The phone buzzed in my coat pocket while I stood there. Caleb again. I watched his name light up and almost answered. I got my thumb over the green button and stopped there, frozen by some stubborn, foolish mix of shame and fatigue. It went to voicemail. A minute later, his message came through, soft and careful, like he was talking to somebody in a hospital room. "Dad, I'm headed home from shift. I can come up Sunday if you want. I'll bring groceries, fix that porch step if it's still loose. Lily drew you a train again. You don't have to talk. Just text me a thumbs up so I know you're breathing, okay? I sat on the edge of the bed with the phone in my hand until the screen went black. I didn't text him. I split wood instead because splitting wood had an outcome you could stack in a straight line. Boone stayed near the chopping block and watched each swing like quality control. I worked until my forearms trembled and my shirt stuck cold to my back. When I finally stopped, dusk had already settled in the pines. The westbound manifest came through after 10, right on its usual window, horn low in the canyon, headlights sweeping the cut. I stood on the porch rail and counted cars under my breath, not because anyone asked me to, just because counting kept my mind from drifting where it always drifted. 48 by my count. Tail lights gone. Night closed in again like a door. I slept badly and woke early again. The rain had broken in the night, and cold air moved clean through the cracked window. I brewed coffee stronger this time, burned my tongue, and took it outside where the sky was clear enough to show a stripe of pale gold over the ridge. The ground steamed in little threads where sun touched soaked earth. Boone leaned against my shin while I watched light reach the rails. I remember thinking, with no drama at all, that this might be the rest of my life. Weather, inspections, silence, missed calls, and an old dog who still trusted me for reasons I hadn't earned lately. There was comfort in the thought and sadness too, braided so tight I couldn't separate them. At milepost 47, the mountain held a quiet I had never heard there, and that was the first thing that made me stop. No jays arguing in the firs, no squirrel chatter, no wing beats lifting out of brush as we approached. Just meltwater under ice and a faint wind moving cedar tips. Not dead quiet, not empty, but padded somehow, as if the whole cut had agreed to lower its voice. Boone halted beside me on the service path, sat down hard, and looked toward a stand of cedars above the inside rail. His ears were up, tail swishing easy against wet leaves. Not a warning posture. More like he'd spotted a friend coming down a lane. "You see somebody, old man?" I asked him, and my voice sounded too loud in that hush. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on that cedar shadow and wagged once, twice, patient and certain. I scanned the trees and saw only trunks, fern, rock, and mist lifting in thin grey sheets. Still, the skin between my shoulders tightened. I waited, listening, expecting a deer to break cover or a hiker to call out. Nothing moved. Boone stood, took 3 steps toward the trees, then came back and pressed his flank against my knee. We stayed there like that for maybe a minute, just breathing steam in the cold. Then he sneezed, shook rain from his coat, and trotted down the line like we had a schedule to keep. I told myself there were ordinary explanations because ordinary explanations had carried me through 52 years of storms and equipment failures and rumors that never became facts. Predators can silence a hillside. Wind direction can shift bird chatter out of a narrow cut. Dogs can misread scent, especially old dogs with cloudy eyes and stiff hips. That was the framework I wrote in my notebook when we got home. April 2nd, dawn patrol, unusual wildlife silence at MP 47, Boone attentive to cedar stand-up slope. No visual confirmation of source. I underlined no visual confirmation twice, then felt faintly ridiculous for underlining my own handwriting, like I was testifying in court. That evening I found dry fir kindling stacked beside my porch woodpile. 8 pieces, all wrist thick, all cut clean, all laid with the bark side down like somebody cared how they dried. I stood over it with my coffee mug, rainwater still dripping from the roof edge behind me, and ran through possible causes. Had I cut them myself and forgotten? No. Mine were mostly round splits from wet alder that hissed in the stove. Could Caleb have driven up while I was on patrol? He had work and lived 90 minutes away. Could a neighbour have dropped them off? Nearest place was over the ridge, and no truck tracks marked the mud. Boone walked to the pile, sniffed once, and sat beside it calmly, tail tapping the porch post like he approved the craftsmanship. "Well," I said to him, because there was nobody else to say it to, "you thank your forest elves if you see 'em again." It came out dry and awkward, and I laughed once at myself, short and embarrassed. Then I carried the kindling inside and set it by the stove. It lit fast and clean, no hiss, no smoke. I watched those first flames catch and felt, for the first time in months, a tiny interruption in the grey routine. Not joy, not relief, just curiosity, small and bright as a nailhead in sunlight. By the third morning of that strange quiet, I found 2 smooth river stones, balanced on a tie plate near the curve. One dark grey, one tan, stacked in a way that should have toppled with the first vibration from passing freight. They sat steady, centered between bolt heads as neat as a display on a mantel. I crouched and looked for prints in the mud around the tie ends, but Thor had turned everything to blurred impressions and run-off streaks. Boone padded up, sniffed the stones, then looked upslope and gave a low, contented whine I had not heard from him in weeks. Not anxious, expectant, like he was waiting for someone to step into view. I logged that too. April 4th, MP 47 outer curve. 2 riverstones balanced on tie plate. No obvious prank indicators. No nearby boot tread distinct enough for ID. I added a second line after a long pause. Boone remains calm at sight, repeated friendly orientation towards Cedar Slope. Writing it made me feel both steadier and less certain, which is a hard combination to explain unless you've lived it. Evidence anchored me. Evidence also widened the question. I put the stones in my coat pocket and carried them home, then stopped halfway up the path, turned around and carried them back to the tie plate exactly where I'd found them. I can't tell you why. It just felt right to leave the gesture where it was made. That night, with the stove ticking and Boone asleep on the rug, I took out my phone and replayed Caleb's voicemail twice. On the second pass, I hit reply and typed, "I'm okay, busy up here. Tell Lily Frogs are excellent people." I stared at the message for a full minute, then sent it before I could back out. His response came almost at once. "Will do. Love you, Dad." I set the phone down beside the notebook and looked at the rain starting again on the window, thin silver lines in porch light. And for the first time since I'd come to Ravencut, the silence in the house felt less like punishment and more like room enough for something I hadn't made space for yet. I left the phone on the kitchen table that night instead of turning it face down, and that tiny choice felt bigger than it should have. The stove gave off a dry cedar heat, from the kindling I still couldn't account for, and Boone snored with one paw twitching like he was running in his sleep. Rain stitched itself across the window glass in fine silver lines. I sat there with my notebook open to the last entry and read my own block letters until they stopped looking like report language and started looking like a man trying, clumsily, to stay honest. At some point, I realized I was waiting for dawn, not dreading it. That was new. I didn't call it hope. I called it curiosity, and let that be enough. At first light the next morning, the thaw had turned Ravencut into a study in movement. Water moved, mud moved. Loose shale moved one pebble at a time down the slope above the inside rail. Even the air seemed to travel in layers, cold along the creek, warmer above the ballast where the sun hit dark stone. I went down earlier than usual, coffee still too hot in my hand, because I wanted another look at the tie plate where I'd left the stacked stones. Boone took the lead for once, tail up, moving with purpose despite his stiff right hip. He didn't sniff around the way he usually did. He walked straight to the curve, stopped by that same cedar-facing stretch, and sat. Just sat there, calm as porch weather, watching the trees. The stones were gone from the plate. They hadn't fallen. They were gone, cleanly, and in their place sat 3 pine cones lined in a row with their stems pointing east, like compass needles. I stood there a long moment with my mug cooling in my hand and stared at those cones the way a mechanic stares at a bolt that has no business fitting that thread, but somehow does. No boot prints, no candy wrappers, no beer cans, no prank signs. The ballast shoulder held only rain-pocked mud and the softened marks of deer and raccoon tracks. Boone sniffed the cones, then looked upslope and wagged once, measured and sure. "Okay," I said, because plain words were all I had. "I see it." I wrote it down standing there, notebook braced on my forearm, pencil digging grooves through damp paper. April 6th, MP47 outer curve. Prior stones removed, 3 pine cones placed in linear arrangement on tie plate. No human sign observed. Canine calm, oriented to cedar stand as before. Then I added, after a pause, "Pattern now exceeds coincidence threshold." That phrase made me shake my head at myself. I was writing about pine cones like they were signal test results. Still, the line stayed. When we climbed back toward the house, Boone veered off the path near a mossy stump about 30 yards from the porch. He nosed under a fern, pawed once, and set down half of the biscuit I'd given him after breakfast, careful as if placing an offering at church. Then he backed up and sat, watching the tree line. I watched him do it and laughed under my breath, because what else was there to do? My old cattle dog, who had spent his whole life stealing food and denying it, was now voluntarily sharing rations with somebody I hadn't met. "Well, look at you," I told him. Diplomatic Corps. That afternoon I split 2 rounds and restacked the damp side of the woodpile. Tucked between the lower logs, dry and clean, I found a shed antler tip I had never seen before, smooth at the base, 4 inches long, polished by weather. Boone came over, touched it with his nose, and gave that same low, contented whine. I did not put it in my pocket. I set it on the porch rail and left it there until dark. By sundown, it was gone. The next morning kept the same strange rhythm. Small signs, no spectacle, and Boone acting like this was all perfectly ordinary neighbor behavior. A game trail above the outer rail that had been choked with windfall was suddenly passable. Dead branches moved aside in tidy drifts, rather than snapped and scattered. The following morning I found fresh water pooled in a shallow scrape near the stump, where Boone left his offerings, lined with flat stones to keep the mud from sliding in. Nobody did that by accident. Somebody had done careful work with large hands and a lot of patience. On the morning after that, I caught myself scanning every line of trees, not with dread, but with a kind of attentive respect I hadn't felt toward anything in months. I went through my disbelief routines anyway, because that was still my nature. I made a list at the kitchen table while rain ticked on the roof. Unknown local person with odd habits, coordinated prank by track crew, stress response and pattern overreading, memory error due to poor sleep. Then I listed counterpoints beneath each one. No tire tracks, no boot impressions distinct enough to follow. Repeated timing before dawn. Boone trust behavior consistent. Object placement near active infrastructure with no sabotage intent. By the time I set the pencil down, I wasn't convinced of anything except this. Dismissing what I was seeing would be less rational than recording it. That landed harder than I expected. I had spent a long season pretending numbness was clarity. It wasn't. Caleb called just after supper while I was rinsing a skillet. I answered on the second ring before I could overthink it. He went quiet for half a breath, then said, "Hey, hi, you okay?" "Yeah," I said. My voice came out rough from disuse. "I'm okay. Sorry, I've been, you know." "You don't owe me a speech," he said. "I just wanted to hear you." We talked maybe 5 minutes, maybe 7. He told me Lily had lost a front tooth and was furious the tooth fairy paid less than inflation justified. I told him I'd review the fairy contract language. He laughed, the real kind, and I realized I had missed that sound more than I knew. Before we hung up, he said, "You eating?" "Mostly." "Sleeping?" "Some." "You need me up there this weekend?" I looked out the window at the dark line of cedars above Ravencut and said, "Not this weekend. Soon, though. I mean that." "I'll take soon," he said. "Love you, Dad." "Love you too, son." After the call, I stood at the sink with my hands flat on the counter and let the weight of those words settle where it wanted. Not fixed, not finished, just spoken. The next morning, the weather shifted again. A wet, low cloud came down the mountain and sat in the cut so thick it softened every edge, rail and rock and fir alike. Mist beaded on my jacket and gathered on Boone's whiskers until he looked old as winter. We reached the curve at first light and the world narrowed to 30 yards in any direction. The usual bird noise stayed absent. Not empty, just hushed, like a room where somebody was recovering. Boone moved ahead, then stopped near the outer rail and turned to check that I was with him. His tail was loose, his ears were forward. He gave a small chuff and looked uphill into the alders. I smelled wet cedar first, and underneath it something warm and animal. Not rank, not sharp, just present. I told myself black bear because bear was available to reason and fit inside known categories. Then I saw movement through the mist above the railbed where the game trail crossed loose rock. Dark shape, high at the shoulder, stepping from one alder pocket to the next, with deliberate placement, testing each foothold before committing weight. Too tall for bear upright, too broad for any man I'd ever worked with, and covered in dark fur that held rein in heavy lines. It moved sideways to me for a moment, and the scale of it rewrote the scene. The saplings beside it reached maybe mid-thigh. I did not run. I didn't freeze either. I stood there with my boots in wet ballast and my notebook half out of my pocket, feeling my old arguments fail in real time. I told myself this couldn't be real. I told myself fog distorts distance, and slope exaggerates size, and grief makes a mind unsteady. Then the figure paused beside a young fir no thicker than my wrist, and stepped around it rather than through it, placing one enormous foot on a bare patch of ground between stones, as if trying not to crush what didn't need crushing. That one choice undid me more than its size did. Predators in a hurry break what's in front of them. This was careful. Boone took 3 steps forward, tail wagging at knee height, and sat down. He looked from me to the figure and back again like he was introducing neighbors over a fence line. "Morning," I heard myself say, voice low and ridiculous in the mist. "We're just checking the curve." The figure turned its head toward us. I saw the face then, partly veiled by rain and alder leaves, broad and dark with deep-set amber-brown eyes that held steady on mine. No bared teeth, no raised posture, just watchful attention, old and calm and unreadable in the way wild things often are when they've already decided not to harm you. Water ran off its forearms in thin streams. One hand rested against a cedar trunk, fingers long enough to curl halfway around the bark. We stayed in that shared stillness long enough for me to hear my own breath, and the creek below, and, far up canyon, the faint horn of a freight still miles away. Time didn't stop. It widened. I was aware of every detail at once, The slick shine on the rail, Boone's damp fur against my pant leg when he leaned in, the smell of wet earth, the ache in my chest that had sat there since Marie died and had suddenly shifted, just a little, as if making room. The figure moved first. It dipped its head once, not a bow exactly, more an acknowledgement, then crossed the slope above us with those same measured steps, avoiding loose shale, avoiding saplings, choosing stable ground with a trackman's caution. At one point it paused beside a rockfall scar and used its foot to nudge a fist-sized stone away from the drainage line, clearing a narrow run for water to pass. Practical, intentional. Then it passed behind thicker cedar and was gone into mist without hurry and without drama, the branches settling quietly after it went. I stayed where I was until the cloud thinned and daylight sharpened the cut again. Boone sniffed the spot where it had stood, sneezed and trotted back to me, satisfied. My knees felt weak in that post-adrenaline way, but fear wasn't what I was carrying. It was awe, yes, but also a strange relief, like some internal part I had locked up for safekeeping had finally been handed back. At the house, I stripped off my wet jacket, sat at the table, and wrote 4 full pages before the details could blur. I logged distance estimates, direction of travel, gait pattern, weather conditions, Boone's behavior, my own uncertainty. I wrote that the figure displayed awareness of fragile vegetation and unstable slope. I wrote that no threatening movement occurred. I wrote that eyewitness credibility was complicated by emotional state, but supported by physical trace potential. Then I stopped trying to sound like a deposition and wrote one plain line under all of it. I knew, somehow, that I wasn't in danger. After breakfast, I walked back down with a folding rule and camera, still half expecting to find nothing and blame fog. Instead, I found a line of deep prints in the mud above the outer rail, each one longer than my forearm from wrist to fingertip. Heel to toe, pressing clean through the top layer into firmer soil. The stride spacing matched what I'd seen. Near one print, the young fir it had stepped around stood untouched, needles bright with rain. I photographed the impressions with my boot beside them for scale, measured what I could without disturbing edges, and marked the page in my notebook with a paperclip. I didn't send the photos to anyone. Not yet. I stored them on the old laptop in a folder labelled Drainage Survey, which felt like a coward's name and a practical one at the same time. Some truths needed a little shelter before you carried them into daylight. That evening, as dusk settled over Ravencut and Boone dozed with his head on my boot, I set half a biscuit and the smoothest of my own riverstones by the stump and said, quietly, to the cedars, "Much obliged." The cedars answered with rain dripping off their lower boughs and the soft click of Boone's tags when he shook his neck. I stayed by the stump longer than made sense, hands in my jacket pockets, feeling foolish and steady at once. Dusk had gone from blue to charcoal, and the curve below the house held that muted rail hum that comes an hour before a scheduled freight, the steel talking to itself in little temperature sounds. Boone took the biscuit I'd set out, carried it 3 feet to the left, and put it back down with careful teeth. Then he sat, facing the tree line, tail swishing once against wet grass. "Negotiating terms?" I asked him. He ignored me in the dignified way old dogs do when they're busy with important work. I stepped backward to the porch and leaned against the post, trying to make myself smaller in the scene. If this was real, if any of it was real, barging toward it would be the fastest way to break it. For a while, nothing happened except evening settling in layers. Creek noise rose. A barred owl started up ridge and then went quiet. Boone never moved from his spot. Then a shape separated from shadow at the cedar edge. Not sudden, not theatrical, just present where it hadn't been a moment earlier. and walked into the open with the same measured care I'd seen in the mist above the rail. He was closer than before, maybe 40 yards from the porch, big enough that scale stopped being an idea and became a fact my eyes had to work around. Dark fur lay in rain-dark ropes over his shoulders and arms, his head turned between Boone and me, calm and direct. He did not crouch to hide himself. He did not rush. He stood like he belonged there as much as Stump and Stone did. I had spent my whole adult life training myself not to romanticize what I couldn't verify. Yet standing there in my own yard, watching that enormous figure pause so Boone could rise and approach at his own pace, I felt my skepticism shift from weapon to tool. It was still useful, it just wasn't in charge anymore. Boone walked up to him, tail level, and sat down at his feet. The creature lowered one hand, palm open, and held it still. Boone sniffed, licked once, and leaned his shoulder against that knuckle ridge like he did with my knee. I actually whispered, "Well, I'll be to nobody in particular," and then, because my nerves were all crossed, said out loud, "Excuse me," as if I'd interrupted a private meeting on my own lawn. If there's a record somewhere of dignified human behavior in extraordinary circumstances, I did not add to it that night. He looked toward me when I spoke. Those amber-brown eyes had the same steady quality as before, alert, without hard edges. I raised my empty hands a little, not in surrender, just to show I had no tool in them. "I'm Glenn," I said. "That's Boone. You knew that part already." No answer except rain tapping the porch roof, and Boone's contented grunt. The creature shifted his weight and took 2 steps closer to the stump, each step placed around low spring shoots in the grass. He picked up the smooth riverstone I'd left there, turned it in his fingers as if feeling the shape, then set it back down beside the biscuit Boone had moved. After that, he reached behind the stump and placed something I hadn't seen him carrying, a straight length of dry cedar, split and clean, perfect stove kindling, gift for gift. I felt the back of my throat tighten. Not fear, recognition. He stayed another minute in plain sight. That mattered almost more than anything else. A wild thing that wants distance takes it fast. He remained in the open long enough for me to see that he wasn't hiding from me, and wasn't trying to make me hide from him either. The arrangement was simple and respectful. Shared ground, clear space. When he finally turned uphill, he glanced back once, tapped 2 fingers lightly against the cedar trunk beside him, and moved into the trees with a rolling, quiet gait that somehow made less noise than I did walking to my truck. Boone returned to me and pressed against my shin, damp and warm and smug as a man who'd been right all along. Inside, I lit the lamp, opened my notebook, and wrote until my hand cramped. Distance estimate from porch to stump. Weather, wind direction. Boone's body language before, during, after. Item exchange observed directly. No threat displays, no vocalization beyond normal breath. I wrote 1 page as if Ed Pollard might audit it, then another page in language fit for a human being instead of an incident report. I wrote that I had never seen power held so gently. I wrote that I had spent months believing the world had narrowed to loss and routine, and that tonight the world had widened without asking my permission. By the 2nd week of April, the exchange settled into a rhythm I could not explain and no longer tried to insult by dismissing. Some mornings there'd be a small stack of dry sticks by the porch, always cut clean, always barked down. Some evenings Boone left half a biscuit or an antler nub at the stump and found a braided grass ring there by dawn. Once I set out a rusted rail spike I'd kept from a retired section and got back a flat riverstone with a quartz seam running through it, like a bright track line. I kept that one on the kitchen sill. I also started talking out loud on the porch at dusk, partly because quiet had stopped feeling like punishment, partly because the words needed to exist somewhere outside my own chest. I'd talk about ordinary things first: culvert silt, fence repair, the westbound running 10 minutes hot. Then, one evening with mist hanging low in the drawer, I heard myself say Caleb's name without flinching. "My boy called again," I said toward the cedars. I answered this time. No shape appeared. No branch moved. Still, I had the feeling of being listened to, and that did more good than I can defend in technical terms. 3 days later, kindness stopped being symbolic and became immediate. We were on dawn patrol above the inside rail where an old service fence used to run before storms took most of it down. The ground there was a mess of thaw soft mud, blackberry canes and hidden wire from decades of half-finished repairs. Boone trotted ahead, nose down, then cut left into brush, and yelped hard enough to turn my bones cold. I dropped the maul and pushed through cane, calling his name. He was 10 yards in, twisted around a young alder, one front leg caught in a cable loop anchored low to a buried stake. Not railroad gear. Poacher snare, old and mean. Every time he pulled, the loop bit tighter. He was panting, eyes wide, trying not to scream again. "Easy, buddy, easy, I got you." I went to my knees in mud and grabbed the cable. It was cold, slick, and cinched so tight I couldn't get 2 fingers under it. I dug for the anchor with my bare hand, found the stake, tried to rock it loose. It held. I pulled my multi-tool, worked the pliers on the crimp, slipped twice. Boone thrashed once and I put my forehead against his neck to steady him. "Hold still, Boone. Please, hold still." That was when I heard the careful footfalls behind me, heavy but controlled, coming through brush without breaking more than necessary. I looked up and saw him standing 3 paces away, framed by alder trunks, watching Boone, then me. I did not have room left in me for disbelief. I had room for one thing. "Help me," I said. He came forward immediately, slow enough not to spike Boone's panic. He crouched, broad shoulders folding down, and extended one hand toward Boone's chest. Boone looked up, gave a sharp breath, then settled under that touch, as if someone had turned down the volume on his fear. The creature's other hand found the cable near the loop, not yanking, not tearing, just creating slack with patient pressure while I worked the crimp again with pliers that suddenly had the millimeter I needed. Got it, keep him there." The wire gave with a dry snap. I pulled the loop free and Boone scrambled against me, shaking. The creature stayed crouched until Boone stopped trembling, then reached into the brush, found the hidden stake in one pull, and set it on open ground where I could see exactly what had trapped my dog. Then he did something that made the whole moment unmistakable in intention. He moved along that fence line for maybe 20 yards, scanning low through cane and fern, and pulled up 4 more snare rigs one by one. Each one he laid at my boots in a neat row. Cable loop, stake, crimp, all rust and cruelty and quiet waiting. No dramatics, just removal. I sat back in the mud with Boone pressed against my hip and looked at that row of traps, then up at him. "Thank you," I said, voice breaking clean in the middle. "For him. Thank you." He held my gaze, then touched 2 fingers lightly to Boone's shoulder, same way he'd touched the cedar the night in the yard. Boone licked his wrist. The creature rose, stepped backward to give us room, and disappeared uphill through wet brush with that same deliberate, ground-reading stride. I stayed there until my breathing evened out. Boone's leg was raw but not broken. I rinsed it with water from my bottle, wrapped it with a clean rag from my tool bag, and clipped his leash on for the walk home, something I hadn't needed in years. He leaned into me the whole way, limping but game, On the porch, I spread the recovered snares on a tarp and photographed each one beside a tape measure. Physical evidence, documented and bagged. Then I called County Game Warden Pike from the number taped inside my cabinet door. He answered on the fourth ring. Pike. Glenn Ramsey up at Ravencut. I pulled 5 illegal cable snares off the old service fence line this morning. One caught my dog. His tone sharpened. Boone okay? Shaken up, legs cut, not deep. You leave the snares where found. Negative. Collected to prevent reuse. I've got photos with location markers. Good. Bring them to substation by noon if you can. I'll log and run patrol through there. I drove down before lunch, with Boone on the bench seat and the snares in contractor bags. Pike met me at the back door, took one look at the bundle and swore softly under his breath. Mean work, he said, flipping a cable in gloved hands. Not for food, just mean. He logged each snare, signed my chain of custody sheet, and gave Boone a dog biscuit from his desk drawer. We'll sweep that line tomorrow at first light. Appreciate you moving fast. Outcome clear and done. Evidence submitted, patrol scheduled. By sunset, I was back on the porch at Ravencut, Boone asleep with his bandaged leg stretched toward the stove. I set a fresh biscuit by the stump, and beside it, one of Marie's old green garden gloves with the patched thumb, the one I had not been able to move for months. Not to give away for good, just to set down for a night as a marker of trust. The cedars stood quiet against a pale sky, and when darkness came, I did not feel alone in the old way anymore. I stayed on the porch until the last of the ridge light drained out, one hand on the post, listening to Boone's breathing and the stove ticking through the wall behind me. The biscuit and Marie's glove sat by the stump where I'd left them, pale in the dark grass, and I felt raw just looking at that patched thumb in the porch light. I had moved that glove 10 feet from the mudroom, and it felt like I had moved a gravestone. Boone lifted his head before I heard anything. His ears tipped forward, tail gave one slow thump, and he stood with a stiffness that came from age, not alarm. He took 3 limping steps off the porch, paused and looked back at me like he was checking whether I planned to behave myself. Then he went to the stump and sat facing the cedars. A shape eased out of the trees so gradually it looked less like an arrival and more like the dark choosing a form. He stopped at the edge of the yard, broad shoulders silvered by a thin wash of moon through cloud, rain still hanging in his fur from the branches he'd passed under. He was farther back than the night before, maybe 50 yards, and he waited there while Boone stayed seated between us, old referee that he was. I did what I had learned to do by then. I held still and let the moment set its own pace. He came forward in that careful way of his, placing each foot where grass was open, stepping around the new shoots near the stump. When he reached the biscuit, he did not take it right away. He looked at the glove first. He knelt, long fingers turning it over with an attention that made my throat tighten again. He pressed the patched thumb between finger and palm, gentle as a man testing cloth in a store, then looked up at me. Not a question, not permission, recognition. I couldn't move it, I said, and my voice was already shaking. Not till tonight. The words opened something I had kept bolted shut for months. I sat down hard on the porch step because my knees gave out without asking me first. I put both hands over my face and tried to breathe through it. But grief doesn't care if your plan is dignity. It came up like floodwater, fast and cold, and I let it. I cried into my palms with Boone watching me and that great quiet figure 10 paces beyond him, and all the held-back pieces started coming loose at once. Hospital lights, Marie's empty chair, Caleb's unheard voicemails, Lily's frog painting, every breakfast I'd eaten standing up because sitting across from nobody hurt too much. I told myself for months that function was the same thing as healing. Keep the stove fed. Keep the ditch clear. Keep writing the notebook. Don't make trouble for other people. I could hear that old script in my head even then, steady and useless. Another part of me answered it for the first time. I am tired of surviving by subtraction. I am tired of measuring my days by what I refuse to feel. I am tired of calling silence strength. The porch boards were damp under my boots. My chest ached, and still I felt a kind of relief in saying it to the night, where it couldn't be argued with. Boone came and leaned against my leg. The creature lowered himself onto one knee near the stump, never crowding me, simply staying where I could see him. He set the glove down again, this time folded, with the patched thumb facing up. Then he laid the biscuit beside it and added 2 cedar sprigs, crossed neatly over both, like a marker that said, "This mattered. No drama. Just care." "I miss her every hour," I said, looking at the glove, then up at him. "I've been mad at everybody because she's gone. I've been mad at my boy for still having a life. That ain't fair to him." The creature watched, steady and calm. Boone gave a soft huff and rested his chin on my knee. I pulled my phone from my pocket with hands that still trembled and dialed Caleb before I could talk myself out of it. He answered so fast it felt like he had been holding the phone. "Dad?" "Yeah, it's me." I swallowed and tried again. "I'm here. I'm really here tonight." A short silence then. "You okay?" "I'm not okay," I said, and the honesty of it made me breathe easier. "But I'm done pretending I am. I'm sorry I shut you out. I'm sorry I left you carrying all of it alone. I should have answered. Every time." He let out a shaky breath. "You don't have to fix it in one call." "I know. I just needed you to hear me say it." "I hear you," he said. "Lily's asleep, but I'll tell her Grandpa called. You want us up there this weekend, we'll come. If you want quiet, we'll give you quiet. You set the terms." "Come Saturday," I said. "Bring that loose porch step attitude." He laughed once, wet around the edges. "You got it. Love you, Dad." "Love you too, son." I ended the call and sat with the phone in my lap, crying quieter now, like the storm had moved through and left steady rain. The creature rose slowly, picked up the glove again, and took 2 steps toward the porch. He did not cross the bottom step. He reached out and placed the folded glove on the rail post where I rested my coffee most mornings, then stepped back. It was such an ordinary, respectful gesture that it cut deeper than anything grand could have. He wasn't taking Marie away. He was handing her back in a form I could carry. By the time the cloud cover thinned and a few stars showed over the cut, my breathing had settled. We stayed there in shared stillness, the 3 of us in a loose line between house and trees, and the mountain sounds returned one by one. Creak over stone, a night bird far upslope, the soft metallic ping of cooling rail. I wiped my face on my sleeve and managed a small laugh at myself. "Well," I said quietly, "that was overdue." Boone's tail thumped twice, as if he agreed with the project timeline. A little after midnight, with mist rebuilding in the low ground, the creature shifted his weight towards the trees. He looked at Boone first. Boone stood, hobbled 2 steps forward, and stopped. Then the creature looked at me and held my gaze long enough for me to understand what was being offered and what was being kept. Company, not ownership. Kindness, not capture. Mystery, still intact. "Thank you," I said. "For him. For me. For tonight." He dipped his head once. He turned uphill and began to walk. There was no backward flourish, no cracking branches, no effort to be seen. He moved through cedar shadow with the same deliberate care he used everywhere else, stepping over fern crowns, skirting loose shale, leaving the yard exactly as he found it except for the calm he'd set down there. Within seconds the dark took him back. A branch swayed once, then stilled. I did not follow. That felt like part of the agreement too. Boone stood at the edge of the grass, watching the place where he had gone, then returned to me and pressed his shoulder into my shin. I picked up the glove from the porch rail and held it to my chest for a moment, not like a relic this time, more like a tool I had finally remembered how to use. Then I hung it on the mudroom hook where it had always lived, and when I came back out, I placed one smooth river stone on the stump beside the cedar sprigs and biscuit crumbs. The night freight came through sometime after 1, westbound and right on rhythm, horn rolling up canyon before the headlight rounded Ravencut. I stood by the porch post while 48 cars clattered past, counting without needing to, feeling the old rail cadence in my ribs and a new softness under it. I wasn't outside my life watching it pass anymore. I was in it. By first light, a low fog sat in the drawer, and the yard smelled of wet earth and stove smoke. Boone ate breakfast with his usual serious concentration and limped less than yesterday. I opened the notebook at the kitchen table and wrote 6 pages by hand, not just measurements and weather this time, but what I had said and what I had finally heard in my own voice. I logged the glove, the cedar sprigs, the phone call timestamp, the train passage time. I printed 2 photos of the snare line from yesterday and clipped Warden Pike's receipt to the entry, so there was no loose end in the record. Before Pike's truck came through, Boone and I made a short check to MP 47. At the high side above the curve, I found a fresh tension crack running near parallel to the shoulder, maybe 12 feet, with water beading in it. 20 yards west, the ballast shoulder had sloughed another 2 inches, and a new scatter of fist-sized shale sat tight to the field side of the rail. Back home, I logged both with time marks and circled slide risk rising. Around 7:30, a county truck crawled the service road below the house. Pike had kept his word. I waved from the porch and he waved back through the windshield, then rolled toward the fence line with one deputy in the passenger seat. Near 9, he called, "Ramsey, we swept your flagged stretch and another half-mile west. No additional rigs found. Looks like your pull yesterday got the cluster." "Appreciate it," I said. "That closes it." "It does. Give Boone a pat from me." "Will do." I hung up, wrote patrol outcome confirmed in the margin, and shut the notebook with my palm flat on the cover. Outside, the cedars above Ravencut held still in the morning haze, watchful and unhurried. The place where he had stepped back into the trees looked ordinary again, which somehow made it feel more true. I scratched Boone behind the ears, looked toward the stump, and got on with the day. I got on with the day until the day stopped being ordinary. Rain came back just after noon, harder than the week before, slanting across the cut in grey sheets that erased distance and turned every ditch into a running line. I checked the porch gauge at 1:30 and saw we'd taken nearly an inch since morning. By 3, the creek had climbed brown and fast against the ice shelf, and the slope above the inside rail was ticking steadily with little stonefall. Boone followed me to the mudroom when I reached for my jacket, bandaged leg, stiff but serviceable, and gave me that look that meant he was coming, whether I voted yes or not. "Short patrol," I told him, "in and out." He sneezed at me and limped to the door. At milepost 47, water was doing exactly what water does when gravity gets impatient. The fresh tension crack I'd logged had widened to 2 fingers in places, and a second crack had opened above it in a rough crescent. The ballast shoulder on the curve looked undercut, dark voids appearing where stone should have been tight. I keyed my handheld to call dispatch and got a weak burst, then static. Battery icon blinking red. I smacked the side out of habit, got another hiss, and nothing else. "Of course," I said to the rain. I started upslope to check the slide seam and heard a deep, dull report from above. Not thunder, more like a giant stump settling. I looked up and saw it. A boulder the size of a stock tank already moving, slow at first, then with gathering weight, chewing a shallow trench through wet shale before dropping onto the rail bed with a force I felt in my boots. It landed across the inside track, half on tie ends, half on ballast, big enough to catch a locomotive low and wrong on that curve. Big enough to turn steel into wreckage. I ran to it, maul in one hand, pry bar in the other, and put both shoulders against stone because panic makes fools and workers out of us in equal measure. It didn't budge. I jammed the bar under an edge where the ballast had washed thin, levered until my forearms shook, gained maybe an inch, lost it back. Then I heard the westbound horn up canyon, distant but close enough to count down in my head. I tried radio again. Dead. "Come on," I said to the boulder, to the rain, to anybody listening. "Come on." Boone barked once behind me, not frantic, just sharp and aimed uphill. I turned and he was staring towards Cedar Shadow with his tail high, rain streaming off his ears. He stepped out of the trees at a trot that was somehow both urgent and controlled, took in the stone, the rail, me, and moved straight to the uphill side without a second of confusion. No display, no hesitation. He planted both feet in mud that would have sent me sliding, set his shoulder and both hands against the wet face of the boulder and pushed. The stone shifted a fraction. I dropped back to the lower edge, drove the pry bar under where he had created space and yelled over rain, "Again!" He leaned with full body weight, muscles bunching under dark fur, and the boulder rolled another partial turn, grinding tie plate and ballast in a scream of wet rock. I kicked loose stone from the run-out path so it wouldn't snag. He adjusted, pushed in increments, never wild, always deliberate, each surge timed with my levering. The horn sounded again, louder now, rounding distance into seconds. "Last one," I shouted, half prayer, half order. He gave one final heave and the boulder tipped clear of the inside rail, rolled down the shoulder and settled against the ditch berm just as the headlight burst through rain at the far bend. We dove for the embankment together, me sliding on my hip, Boone tucked against my ribs, the creature dropping low behind the cottonwood stump. The locomotive thundered through where the obstruction had been, wind and spray flattening grass and breath. Engineer laying on the horn as 48 loaded cars hammered past in a blur of steel and water and held track. When the tail lights vanished, all I could hear was rain and my own rough breathing. I sat up in mud, laughed once from pure disbelief, and then cried so hard my shoulders shook. "Thank you, sir," I said into the downpour, because manners still seemed right. He rose from his crouch, looked at me with those same steady amber-brown eyes, then knelt by Boone. From one hand, cupped against the rain, he set a small cluster of purple wildflowers by Boone's collar, petals bent but bright. Boone sniffed them and licked his wrist. The creature touched 2 fingers to the ground between us, then turned uphill and disappeared into cedar and mist without waiting for witness. By the time I got back to the house, the kitchen clock read 4:52, and my hands were still shaking. I plugged the radio to charge, grabbed the landline and called Ed Pollard first. Then dispatch conference, words clipped and clean. Raven cut, MP47 inside curve, slide drop obstructed track, now cleared, but slope unstable and immediate slow order needed. I repeat, immediate slow order. Ed came on the line. "Glenn, you hurt?" "No. Muddy and breathing. Boone's okay. You need geotech and MOW tonight. Boulder came down big." "You clear it yourself?" I looked out the window at rain and cedars and said, "I had help from the mountain being kinder than usual." There was a beat, then Ed answered in the tone of a man deciding not to press what he couldn't file. "Understood. We're issuing 20 through Ravencut until inspection complete. Crew rolling now. 3 days later, under a cleaner sky, I walked the site with Ed, a track supervisor named Marta Keene, and engineer Tommy Voss, whose freight had been the one on that curve. They measured gouge marks, flagged the new fracture line, and photographed the displaced boulder at the ditch edge. Tommy stood with his hands on his hips, looking at the scrape across tie ends, and gave me a long side look before speaking. "Dispatch said you got this moved right before we came through," he said. "That true?" "True enough," I said. He nodded slowly. "Then I owe you my thanks and a lot more paperwork I'm happy to sign." He never asked the second question. He just clapped my shoulder once, hard, and went to help Marta with markers. That look he gave me stayed loaded for exactly 1 minute, and then resolved into respect, which was all either of us needed. I filed a full incident statement that afternoon. Weather conditions, observed slide movement, obstruction dimensions by estimate, failed field radio due battery depletion, manual mitigation, train passage time. No fiction. No mention of what no form could hold. I attached photos of the railbed, ditch berm, and crack progression. I did not attach the older print photos in the folder labelled Drainage Survey. Those remained on my laptop, and, that evening on a small flash drive, I sealed in an envelope marked, "For Caleb, if I'm gone and someone thinks I forgot how to tell the truth." By Saturday morning, the rain had cleared and left the whole cut washed bright. Caleb's truck pulled in just after 8 with a box of deck screws, 2 new porch stringers, and lily and frog rain boots that flashed green every time she jumped from one board to the next. She stopped at my knees and held up a drawing of a train and an oversized dark shape beside the tracks. "Mom said maybe it's a bear," she said, "but I made him nice." I crouched, took the paper gently, and said, "You did good work." Caleb set his tools down, studied my face for a second, and asked, "You sleeping at all?" "More than before," I said. "Come see this step." We worked side by side through the morning, prying rotten wood, setting new stringers, levelling tread with shims. Sawdust and coffee smell mixed in the sun. Lily handed us screws like a quartermaster and announced quality ratings for each board we installed. Boone supervised from a blanket, wildflower petals long gone, but collar still sitting proud. At lunch, we sat on the rebuilt porch with enamel mugs and ham sandwiches. Caleb looked toward the cedars, then back at me. "You said on the phone you had help," he said quietly. "You mean Pike? Neighbor? What did you mean?" I held my mug a while, feeling the warm metal against my palms. "I mean, there are things up here that are bigger than our arguments and gentler than our fear. I'm not asking you to believe every detail. I am asking you to believe I'm done hiding from my own family." He nodded, eyes damp, and let that answer stand. "I can do that." That afternoon, before they drove home, I handed him a copy of my incident report and the warden receipt from the snares. "If anything happens to me, you've got the practical record," I said. Then I tapped my shirt pocket where the sealed flash drive sat. "And there's another record for when you're ready." He didn't open it. He put it in his glove box and squeezed my shoulder. Outcome noted, not deferred. A week later, I returned to light duty with Ed's signature and strict instructions from Marta to leave heroics to younger knees. I took the first official dawn patrol at Ravencut with Boone back on full stride. The curve was stabilized with fresh ballast, improved drainage, and a pinned net along the worst seam. I checked bonds, logged readings, and paused at the old stump before heading home. On the stump sat 2 smooth river stones, one dark grey and one tan, balanced exactly as they had been the first time. I smiled, set my hand beside them without touching, and said, "Roots open, much obliged." I left both stones there until dusk, then carried one to the kitchen sill beside Marie's recipe card and the quartz-seamed stone. The other I returned to the tie plate at milepost 47 on my next patrol. Some gifts were for keeping, some were for continuing. Now, when the westbound rounds Ravencut after 10, I still count cars sometimes. Not because I'm bracing for loss, because I like hearing lives move safely through the dark. Grief stayed, but it no longer runs the whole house. Caleb calls and I answer. Lily brings frog drawings and asks hard questions. Boone sleeps with an old dog's certainty that morning will come. And on clear evenings, with cedar on the wind and steel singing low on the bend, I stand on that rebuilt porch with a warm mug in my hand and feel companioned in a world I once thought had closed.